To graph this function, I'll start by graphing the function y equals 2 cosine of 2x minus pi over 2. So I'll see what points I have there, and then I can sketch the secant graph. The amplitude of this function is 2, because 2 is the coefficient. And then we can find the period. Now normally the period for the cosine function is 2 pi, and we divide that by the coefficient of x, which is 2, so now the period is pi. Finally, I need to find the horizontal shift. So to find that, I take the argument of the cosine function, which is 2x minus pi over 2, set that all equal to 0, and solve for x. And this gives me x equals pi over 4. And that's a positive pi over 4, which means that our graph is going to shift to the right. So, normally, we would graph the cosine function from 0 to 2 pi, but now the period is pi, so then we would graph it from 0 to pi. But we have a horizontal shift, so I need to add pi over 4 to each of these end values, and we get pi over 4 to pi plus pi over 4, which gives me 5 pi over 4. So let's take a look at this cosine graph. All right, let's see. We have our first x value is pi over 4, and that's going to go all the way down to 5 pi over 4. And what's halfway in between those two values? So I'll add them together and divide by 2, and I get 6 pi over 4, divide that by 2, and that's 3 pi over 4. And what's halfway between pi over 4 and 3 pi over 4? Well, that would be pi over 2, right? Because if I ignore the pi's, then it's what's between a quarter and a 3/4, and that would be 1/2. So then what's between 3/4 and 5/4? Well, that would be 4/4, or 1/2, so that's 1/2 pi. So now I've got my x-axis labeled, and then we can label our y-axis, and 0, we have a -2, and a +2. We're graphing the cosine function, which means that we start in the up position. We start at the max, which is 2, down to the middle, to the bottom, to the middle, and back to the top. So, all right, so there we go. We've got our graph sketched out there. So now to actually sketch the graph that we're supposed to graph. So I'll label the axes. That's going to be the same. Pi over 4, pi over 2, and so on. Okay, and y-axis is 0, and -2, and +2. Which is a little high. Yeah, put it down a little bit further there. Okay. So now we are graphing the secant function. First, let me put in my asymptotes. So I have an asymptote at pi over 2 and at pi, because that's where I have x-intercepts. Okay, so there's my asymptotes. Now, let's graph the function. I'll graph it in blue, kind of contrast with the axes. So we have the point pi over 4 comma 2 on the the cosine graph. So I'll put the same point on this graph, and this is going to go upwards because it's in the top of the graph. And then we have 3 pi over 4, negative 2, graph that. We're going to have a little frown down there. That's kind of a terrible graph, but it's hard to graph on this screen here. And 5 pi over 4 comma 2 again. And, oops, let's try that again. There we go. So there's our graph. There's one cycle of the graph to secant of the quantity 2x minus pi over 2.